welcome to Asia in Review at ThinkTech Hawaii, and we're streaming live. I'm your host, Hong Jiang, and with me in the studio is Keith Bettinger, PhD candidate and lecturer at University of Hawaii at Manoa. And today we'll be talking about deforestation in Indonesia, why it's so hard to stop it. Keith, welcome to be here.
Thank you for having me, Hong. It's a pleasure.
Okay, so talking about deforestation, I was just looking at some of the news items, and I saw this one. The Obama administration announced just a couple months ago that the U.S. would invest more in sustainable forestry overseas. Mm-hmm. So the question is, here we're talking about deforestation in Indonesia, and the U.S. government is talking about sustainable forestry overseas. Why do we care about deforestation? People in the U.S. care about deforestation in other lands, other countries.
Well, that's an interesting and complex question, Hong. But there are another number of reasons why we would care about rainforests, and I think a lot of it has to do with who you are. And so we think about the rainforest on a number of different levels, but I think maybe the easiest to explain to people is the sheer existence value of rainforests. So when we think about the tropical rainforests around the world, they cover approximately 6% of the Earth's landmass, but they contain approximately 50% of the terrestrial land-based biodiversity. So
biodiversity is an important one.
I think that's one very important reason. When we think about we can think about biodiversity on several different levels. We think about that biodiversity just as the creatures that are represented by biodiversity. So we have tigers, and we have rhinoceroses, and we have elephants.
Interesting animals, although we don't want to see them on our backyard.
Exactly, right. So that's the place for them.
What about the connection with the global climate? You know, that's been talked a lot about.
Well, that's another benefit that we get from rainforests, and that's another level on which we appreciate rainforests and depend upon them. Rainforests are sites of carbon sequestration.
Can you explain it in simple terms so that people don't have to learn this big term?
Well, I think that most people are aware of global warming and climate change, and normally when we think about global warming and climate change, the one villain, the culprit is greenhouse gases, and the greenhouse gas that we hear about for the most part is carbon dioxide, right?
So basically forests keep the carbon in its tissues.
Right.
And the carbon don't go out into the air and warm up the climate.
That's correct. Yeah. That's correct. So that's on the most basic level. That's why the rainforests are fundamentally important to life as we know it on this planet. But there are a number of other reasons as well, and we can delve into that with increasing complexity. But maybe that's enough for right now. Yeah.
And the next question is why Indonesia, and how important is Indonesia in terms of this whole big question of deforestation?
Well, that's an interesting question too. Indonesia is very important because it's a archipelago like Hawaii. 13,000 islands in the Indonesian archipelago, and it's right on the equator, and so it's right in this zone of biodiversity and where we find very, very rich and lush rainforests, along with Brazil. Most people are familiar with the Brazilian rainforests, and another site of significant rainforest and biodiversity is the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Now, these three countries, Brazil, the Congo, and Indonesia, have the world's largest remaining rainforest. The greatest intact rainforest. And Indonesia has approximately 10% of the world's rainforest spread across the islands. Wow. And so some of them, on some of the larger islands, including Sumatra and Borneo, there are significant intact stands of rainforest.
So, Mr. Producer, maybe this is time if you could bring up a map 1. And if you look at the map 1, that is the red is representing the hotspot, right?
Right. This is a map from Conservation International, which is a large transnational non-government organization dedicated to conservation. And in this map, the redder areas are areas with higher biodiversity and higher endemism, which refers to species that are only found in that particular area. And if we look at the map here, we can see Indonesia. As geographers, we like maps, especially colored maps.
It's pretty red over there. It's red all over.
The redder it is, the more biodiversity you have. And so Indonesia, by any measure, this is just Conservation International's schema for identifying priority places on the Earth. But according to the World Wildlife Fund for Nature, and some other organizations, Indonesia is universally recognized as extremely important for rainforests and for biodiversity and all of the ecosystem services that come along with that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So we hear, in terms of deforestation, we hear a lot about the Amazon, and Indonesia basically is one of the important hotspots that we need to pay attention to.
That's correct.
And something's going on there.
Yes,
you know.
Yes.
So, Mr. Producer, maybe you can put up the next map, map number 2. And here we're looking at, can you explain the second map?
Yeah, this is a map of forests, and then it's another very simple map from the United Nations, and this indicates to us sites where there's significant deforestation going on. And again, redder is normally, it's a standout color on maps. And if we look at Indonesia, red indicates high levels of deforestation, net loss of forest. Now this shows us not only tropical forests, but temperate forests and boreal forests as well. But if we focus on the equatorial region there, we can see these vast belts, these vast swaths of rainforests there in Central Africa and in the Amazon basin there, but we also see Indonesia. But unfortunately, for the rainforests of Indonesia, they are somewhat under siege now, and so we're experiencing a net loss of forest cover there, especially primary forest in Indonesia. Yes.
Let's get to talk about Indonesia.
Yes.
Can you give us some kind of understanding for how much forest has been lost?
Well, again, Indonesia's 13,000 islands, and if you think about it in terms of comparing it to the continental United States, these islands stretch from approximately Massachusetts to California. In around 1900, it's estimated that approximately 85% of the country was forested. And so it was largely forested just 110 years ago, 113 years ago. And now, the most recent estimates based on satellite imagery are that approximately just under 50% of the nation is forested now. So about 94 million hectares, and I know that doesn't mean anything to your viewers, but to put that into perspective, 94 million hectares is approximately the size of Texas and New Mexico put together. And so that's the intact forest, primary and secondary forest, original growth and secondary growth. Forests that have been logged at one point, that's secondary forest. And so that's how much exists now.
So we're talking about in 100 years, there are 30% of the forests are being lost.
Well, more than 30% of the land cover for the country.
That's right. Yeah.
But probably most estimates are around half of the forests have been degraded or deforested. And when we think about that, we say in the period of 100 years, and that's somewhat misleading because large-scale deforestation in Indonesia, especially on some of the outlying islands, did not start until the 1970s. And so it's really in the past 40 years, 30 to 40 years, or 35 to 40 years that we've seen deforestation really take off in Indonesia. So it's not an even temporal phenomenon. It
so
really has,
mostly in the last 40 years,
it's accelerated.
Is it expanding? Is it speeding up? But the loss is...
Well, that's a complex question too, and I think the easiest thing to say is that it goes in cycles. It ebbs and flows, but it never stops.
Okay.
And so now, recent estimates are that in the past year or 2 years, that the current rate over the past 5 years, is just over 1 million hectares, 1.1 million hectares, and again, that means nothing to most people, but that would be an area about the size of the Big Island and half of Maui together.
Okay.
So it's a significant area, and that's annually. But when we look at deforestation trends in Indonesia, we notice that there's a significant correlation or relationship with political developments. And so that
we definitely need to get
yes,
to that.
yes.
Maybe we start with the direct activities that's leading the deforestation. What's the number one activity?
Well, again, that has changed over time. So I mentioned a moment ago that in the 1970s, that's when deforestation started at a large scale in Indonesia, and at that time it was logging for timber.
Yeah.
But the primary drivers have changed over time. So there's still a significant amount of logging in Indonesia, but what we see over the past 10 to 15 years, 20 years, is that logging is it's still an important driver, but the most important driver now is land conversion into large-scale plantations for tree crops. And when we talk about that, people generally think of tree crops as things like rubber, because rubber comes out of a tree. But now the primary tree crop that is driving deforestation in Indonesia is palm oil, or oil palms. Oil palms of the tree. Palm oil is the stuff that comes out of the tree.
That's right.
And most people, I'm not sure if most people are aware of what palm oil is, but it is we're familiar with palms here in Hawaii, obviously. And oil palms have a sort of a date-like fruit that gets harvested, and that gets ground up, and it yields oil, vegetable oil, that is currently it's the most commonly used vegetable oil in the world, and we find it in all sorts of consumer products.
We probably buy them here, right?
I'm sure that you do. I would venture a guess that some of the makeup that you have on contains palm oil.
That's interesting.
Yes.
So we're all wearing part of the reason for Indonesia deforestation or
That's
deforestation elsewhere in the world.
Right. And we find palm oil in chocolate. We find it in all sorts of food products. It's a high energy oil, and so it's very useful. There are a lot of uses for it, and so and the demand for palm oil, because it's cheap, it's easy to grow, and it's high yielding, high energy. Again, the demand for palm oil has been growing steadily over the years, and Indonesia has, as a country, has positioned themselves strategically in the oil palm industry. And so now, over the past 10 years, they've overtaken Malaysia as the world's largest producer of palm oil.
So the conversion of forest land into plantation, that's part of the Indonesia's economic plan, right?
Well, I think that yes, we can say that. I think it may be a simplification to say that it's all part of it's all centrally directed, because that's not quite true. But there are a number of official and unofficial factors that are pushing this conversion to palm oil. And normally we think about the culprits as just corporations that are deforesting large swaths of land and just creating huge oil palm plantations. And that may be the case in some places, but we don't need to vilify corporations too much, because up to a third of Indonesia's palm oil is produced by smallholders. And so there's two ways to think about this. One is the exploitation of the rainforests for corporations, but that's not entirely accurate.
So you said 1/3?
1/3 of all the palm oil produced in Indonesia, according to some figures, is produced by smallholders, so family-owned operations, and so in Indonesia this has been a significant source of income for local people, and it's an upwardly mobile opportunity for a lot of people in rural Indonesia, especially in Sumatra, where I do my research work. Yes.
That's very interesting. We'll ask you to introduce your field site a little later. So we're just going to take a quick break. And I'm Hong Jiang, and this is Asia in Review. And we've been talking with Keith Bedinger about deforestation in Indonesia. When we come back, we'll have more of the story.
Aloha, this is Jay Fidel. ThinkTech and the Hawaii Venture Capital Association put on monthly luncheon panel programs at the Plaza Club here in Pioneer Plaza. Our program this time is on September 26th. It's called Solar in Hawaii. We're going to examine the solar industry and see what's in it for the long haul. We have a great panel, great moderator. We'll be sending out email on this. If you want to be in our email list to receive the details, check out thinktechhawaii.com. In any event, you can sign up for the program at hvca.org. Thanks. See you there. This is Jay Fidel. Mahalo.
Hello, we're back. We're live, and this is Asia in Review, and we've been talking with Keith Bettinger, a lecturer at UH Manoa, on the topic of deforestation in Indonesia. So we were talking about the causes of reasons for deforestation in Indonesia. You're talking about how palm oil or oil palm is one of the main reasons now for deforestation. And so, you know, when you have a production, it goes somewhere. Is it mostly for export? I know you also talk about a third of those plantations were operated by smallholders, and they're basically making subsistence livelihood based on the plantation, right?
Well, that's a good question too, and I would hesitate to say that it's a subsistence basis, because a lot of them it is a way to make. It's a cash income.
Okay.
And so, based on my field work, and again, this is just anecdotal evidence, but every place that I do a lot of work in villages on Sumatra, on the periphery of forests, and I deal a lot with forest users. And one thing that really strikes me about villagers in Sumatra, at least, is that everybody wants to grow palm oil. They may be growing rubber, they may be growing chili peppers, and other potatoes. Potatoes are a popular crop on Sumatra, but there's just a widespread enthusiasm about palm oil because of the opportunities that it presents. And just on 1 to 2 hectares, and a hectare is about the size of a Murakami Stadium, about the size of a baseball field. That's 1 hectare. So if you have approximately 2 hectares of palm oil, then that's significant. That's a significant income for a villager. Yes. I met a villager one time that told me that he had 5. He was well-to-do, and he had 5 hectares that he had acquired over the years, and that enabled. He was very proud of this because he had never gone to school, but this had enabled him to send 2 of his children to university. And so we see not only is this it's an avenue for material gain, but it is also an avenue for human growth and development, and improving livelihoods, and that's how people see it, lots of people see it on Sumatra.
Mr. Producer, maybe we can put up map number 3. It's a palm oil percentage, I believe, right?
So this is palm oil production, and here we can see Sumatra. I know these the map is not labeled. Well, it is labeled, actually. It says Sumatra. Sumatra is a large island over there to the left, and again, that's where I've done my research work. But that's also, as you can see from this map, this is where oil palm is expanding. The population density, for the most part, on Sumatra is not as high as it is on Java. There, as we can also see on this map, and so there's a lot of forest left on Sumatra, but it is a frontier for the expansion of palm oil, and it's happening both from smallholders are opening up forests or converting land. Could they convert old agroforests? We mean agroforests, we mean forests that grow tree crops. So they may be converting their rubber or cinnamon. Cinnamon comes from, there's a significant amount of cinnamon there on Sumatra. Palm oil pays more than these do, and there's a increasing demand for it, and so. So
where are these palm oil go?
Where does it get exported to?
Yeah.
Oh, it goes all over the world.
Okay.
Yeah, but I if I'm not mistaken, Indonesia is also the world's largest consumer of palm oil. So they do a lot of processing there.
Okay.
Yeah.
So as we talked about early on, that it goes everywhere and it goes into a lot of products.
It does,
so
it does.
All of us need to pay attention to the consequence of our consumption.
Yes. So
that's right.
A high percentage of consumer products that we purchase at the Longs or at Walmart or at Foodland, the things that we take for granted that we use every day to beautify ourselves. Or,
that's right. Yeah.
Well, a lot of them have palm oil in them. Yeah.
Make me feel badly.
No, don't feel bad.
So people are able to acquire the land. I'm talking about the smallholders are able to acquire the land for the conversion.
Well, in some cases, it's land that they own. Land ownership and tenure is a very complex issue in Indonesia for a number of reasons. And we find that people's access to land is variable over space. That's one thing that's very interesting to geographers. But yes, if people are able to secure title to land, they will go over to palm oil. Palm oil takes 5, 6, 7 years to start to pay off. So you have an extended period of several years where you have invested in the land and you're not getting any returns.
So it's people who have the capital,
they have the
resources,
and they have the security. But another thing that Indonesia has done over time is it's been a rural development plan, and you see this in Indonesia, you see it in Malaysia, and very basically what happens is the government develops plantation schemes. And in Malaysia, these are Felda schemes, but in Indonesia, they call them nucleus plasma estates, which kind of sounds strange. But what happens is the government will partner with very simply, what the government will do is partner with a corporation, and the corporation will build a refinery that refines the oil palm, the fruit from the oil palm, and they will capitalize people and give them a hectare or 2 hectares, so 1 or 2 baseball fields worth of oil palm, and grant that land to them. For the first few years, they have to work on the land, and they are given small grants. So they're given their expenses, basically their subsistence expenses, and they continue to work. And the idea is that they have to sell their produce to the refinery.
I see.
Right, but after a certain period of time, 10 or 15 years, then they get clear title to that land. So this is a way to get land for people that haven't had land, and it's fairly lucrative. So these things have been in demand. But also, there's a historical pattern in Indonesia whereby, and this is before political developments that we'll talk about later on, I think. But there's a pattern of government-sponsored resettlement from the main island, or not the main island, but the most populous island that has traditionally dominated Indonesian culture and politics. That's the island of Java.
Like Java, okay.
It's a smaller island, as we saw from our map, but 60% of Indonesia's population live there. More than 100 million people live there. It's about the size of California. So you can imagine how densely populated it is. And what the government has done over time is resettled people from Java to other islands, what we call the outer islands, like Sumatra or Sulawesi or Kalimantan, which most people know as Borneo. And they used these plantation types of schemes in some cases to do that. Now, many of them over time have not been very successful, but some of them have been quite successful.
So the drive for the resettlement, was it because it was too dense on Java?
Well, that's a complex question, Hong.
Can you give me an easy quick answer?
We could say that officially the population density is too much. Yeah.
Okay.
The idea is to make unproductive land productive and contribute to the national wealth. But very simply put, Indonesia has had in the past, before 1998, a fairly authoritarian regime, dominated by the Javanese, the Suharto period. And so by transferring these Javanese people and essentially colonizing these outer islands, this was a way to control the outer islands as well, or to exert influence on them.
Interesting. Yes, so the forest became the frontier for people to move to and open up.
So
that's new wealth, right?
Under this Suharto regime that we mentioned, this authoritarian regime, it was at that time that the forest started to be exploited, and this is at this time that we see forests really take on a special meaning in terms of politics and power and control.
Interesting.
Yes,
so you
yes,
talk
yes.
about the deforestation started to take off from the 70s
Yes.
until the 1998, and that was a Suharto period.
Exactly.
Was a rapid period of deforestation.
Exactly.
We'll talk a little bit about like the new policies after the Suharto period. Let's get to talk about logging. You mentioned logging early on,
Right.
and logging has been this well-known kind of activity in Indonesia, Southeast Asia, that's causing some of the deforestation. You're saying the relative importance of it is reduced right now.
That's true.
And is it still happening? And what about illegal logging, both illegal and illegal logging?
Well, that's a good question. Logging is still happening now. It's still a significant source of income. The Indonesian government has an entire ministry, cabinet level, like the department for us, but the Ministry of Forestry, and one of their main responsibilities is the sustainable management of Indonesia's timber and forest resources. And part of that sustainable management is theoretically harvesting. And so that is logging and timber products have traditionally served as a significant source of income for the Indonesian government through permits and concession fees and taxes and things like that.
And who are operating those, logging sites? Companies?
Normally
domestic, international?
corporations. So some of the largest corporations in Southeast Asia and Asia in general are related to logging in Indonesia and cutting down trees, converting them to pulp, but also oil palm. So it's been a very lucrative industry, and there's a lot of wealth tied to it.
So the logging and the plantation are kind of going hand in hand, right?
I think you could say that. Yes,
the law.
But what we see these days, though, you're tempted to say that forests are logged, and you cut down the trees, and then you grow oil palm there, and that is not. I'm sure. I believe that happens, but the dominant method of clearance for palm oil seems to be burning these days, because it's the palm oil is being grown on a degraded land. So degraded land is being converted, but secondary forest as well. And so many of these places where palm oil they're expanding palm oil cultivation are degraded forests. They're not it's not as economically feasible to log them on such a large scale. Yes. But logging, but to get back to your original question, the importance of logging has declined, I think, because Indonesia has logged out a lot of its forests, right? They've used up many of the resources, but also because of the relative importance of conversion to oil palm is increasing as well.
What about illegal logging? I was just reading something a couple days ago, and illegal logging in Indonesia seems to be almost like equal to the kind of quote-unquote legal logging.
Yes.
So why is it still an important cause of deforestation right now?
Well, absolutely it is, and as you can probably imagine, it is very, very difficult to put numbers on illegal logging because
did you meet any illegal loggers?
I have met them in the past. I've met former illegal loggers.
Okay.
One of the conservation and local conservation NGOs that I work with, a very small-scale operation dedicated to preserving forest resources in national parks. The gentleman that founded that is actually a former illegal logger, so that's quite interesting. I have met a lot, and you will meet when you in your travels in Indonesia, as you deal with government bureaucrats and politically elected officials, you will meet illegal loggers but not be aware of it, because there is such a connection between the political elite and the bureaucratic elite, in some cases the police, the national police, and the military. They've all traditionally been involved in illegal logging, especially during the Suharto years. There was kind of a blurry line between legal and illegal logging. during the Suharto years, and as we mentioned, Suharto, he resigned he was deposed essentially in 1998. But since then, there's these historical patterns of exploitation and illegal logging that have persisted into the post-authoritarian era. And so, yes, I have met a lot of them. There are government officials, elected parliamentarians in the local parliaments, district administrators, provincial governors. Many of them have in the past been associated with illegal logging. Yes.
It's very fascinating to think about as a geographer doing field work, and you meet with all kinds of people.
Yeah.
Okay, so we're going to take a short break, and I'm Hong Jiang, and this is Asia in Review, and we've been talking about deforestation in Indonesia. When we come back, we'll have more of the story.
Aloha, I'm Nicole Horry for ThinkTech. For nearly half a century, the Hawaii Foreign Trade Zone No. 9 has brought the benefits of the Foreign Trade Zone program to Hawaii businesses and entrepreneurs. DBET, the Department of Business, Economic Development and Tourism, operates Hawaii's Foreign Trade Zone program to encourage international business and economic development. The Foreign Trade Zone's mission is to increase the amount of international trading activity in Hawaii, thereby providing employment opportunities for the residents of our island state. For more information, see ftz9.org. I'm Nicole Horry. Mahalo. Hello.
Hello, we're back. We're live, and this is Asia in Review, and we've been speaking with Keith Bettinger, lecturer at UH Manoa, about deforestation in Indonesia, why it's so hard to stop it. So we were talking about the causes of deforestation in Indonesia, talking about logging. And logging and illegal logging,
right.
Talking about the percentage, what part is illegally logged?
Yeah. So you mentioned 50%, and again,
the number is probably changing,
well,
right?
Yeah, it changed, obviously, but my initial point was that it's very difficult to count, right? Because illegal logs are illegal.
That's right. They are somewhere in the dark.
The estimates, I've seen estimates as high as 83, 85%, and as low as 65 to 70%. So it's reasonable to assume
illegally logged.
that 75% of timber from Indonesia is logged illegally. And a lot of it goes through Malaysia. So again, if we can imagine in our mind's eye our map of Indonesia, and we have the island of Borneo. Well, Borneo is split between the Indonesian part of Borneo, and then there's also the Malaysian part, which is two states, Sarawak and Sabah, and there's a small, very, very rich country called Brunei there as well. Borneo is, or Kalimantan in Indonesia, that part of the island is another frontier of illegal logging, and it's experienced a significant amount of illegal logging since 1970, and it still is. Well, much of that is the logs that are taken from there are taken overland or down rivers, and they end up in Sarawak in Malaysia. But from other places, such as Sumatra, much of it ends up in China. And so it's raw wood, it's raw logs or planks, timber planks, and they will end up in China. And China, the industries in China process them. China has, as you probably know, one of the world's largest furniture industries, and they have a big demand for paper and pulp, and so much of that wood has been traced to Indonesia illegally. That's illegally harvested wood in Indonesia and elsewhere in Southeast Asia.
So in other words, in order for illegal logging to continue in Indonesia, you have a lot more players than just people in Indonesia.
Well,
you have the
right.
corruption going on in Indonesia, and you have big country like China needing these resources. It's interesting, China has in recent years put a logging ban in their country, but then they are drawing on resources elsewhere.
Well, that's an interesting dynamic that you see elsewhere as well. So if I'm not mistaken, Thailand instituted a ban on logging as well in the 1990s. And when that happened, there was a spike. There was an increase in illegal logging in Burma, or Myanmar, or however you want to refer to that country.
That's right.
So you have these ripple effects, and essentially it's a displacement. So it's not exactly solving the problem, but it's shifting it.
It's a balloon that when you push in one place, it comes out somewhere else.
That's correct. That's correct.
Wow. So that's, we named this title like why it's so important, so hard to stop deforestation.
Yeah,
you can see.
So what you've hit on the external, one of the prime drivers is the fact that there exists a market.
That's right.
There exists a demand.
As long as you can sell it, somebody's going to harvest it.
That's correct.
Other than the palm oil and logging, what other factors or drivers are causing deforestation in Indonesia?
One phenomenon or one process, I suppose you'd say, that I observed quite a bit when I was doing my field work. I do a lot of work around a national park.
Talk about your field work.
Well, okay, then we can preface this by discussing my research work. I work on Sumatra at a national park. It's called Kerinci Seblat National Park. And again, I'm going to give you the area. It's 1.3, almost 1.4 million hectares. So you can think of that as 1.4 million less Murakami stadiums, or you can think of it as an area that's larger than the Big Island, Maui, and Oahu all put together.
Such a big national park,
exactly.
One park?
This is a large, it's just one park.
Okay.
And
I can see that must be difficult to manage it. You have such a big park.
Very difficult to manage it, and in fact, one of the prime difficulties they face there, and this is common in national parks all over Indonesia, is that the whole area, and it's got a 2,500 kilometer border. What's 2,500? That's about 1,500 miles. Okay. Yeah, the border around this park is about 1,500 miles. But there are approximately 75 active rangers to patrol this border, to patrol the park. So they're spread very, very thin. But the phenomenon that I'm very interested in, and we've alluded to this, we've mentioned Suharto and this dictator. He was an authoritarian ruler. And during the Suharto years, which ranged from 1966 to 1998, that's 32 years, Suharto essentially constructed a top-down system of governance. It was very highly centralized.
That's right.
And the way that he enforced his will was through his control of the military. Well, we've already mentioned that during this period, the island of Java essentially dominated the other islands, right? And so Suharto, who was Javanese and ruled from Java, controlled the outer islands like Sumatra. And during this period, Suharto issued permits to his friends and generals and other people close to the regime so that they could exploit the natural resources of Sumatra and other islands. And so they were able to get rich from logging. Yeah.
What about after the Suharto period?
Well, after the Suharto period, Suharto was deposed amidst street protests and a financial crisis.
Yeah.
And the people of Indonesia and the government, which until Suharto fell was essentially a rubber stamping body, right?
That's right.
What they did is they immediately started to institute reforms to chart a new course for the country. So they embarked upon a path of democratization and to move themselves away from this centrally dominated system that was so exploitative to the outer islands and that marginalized many of the people on the outer islands.
Take down a lot of the forest there.
Exactly,
that's
and
right,
led to all of this resource extraction. Well, what they did is they removed the power from the central government and they decentralized power.
Okay.
So as geographers, we're very interested in scale. And one way we think about scale is different scales of government or control, the different scales at which people make decisions.
And this park now, which body is managing the park?
Well, that's very interesting. The park, as big as it is still under the control of the central government.
Okay.
But it is surrounded by 15 of what you might call counties. In Indonesia, they're called kabupatens or districts. And this is the middle tier. So in the United States, as you know, we have the federal government, and then we have state governments, and beneath that we have counties.
That's right.
In Indonesia, they have five levels of government. And what they did in these decentralization reforms that I mentioned earlier is they gave significant powers to the middle level, which is essentially equivalent to the county in the United States. And what this did is, so there's 15 counties around the park, right? And so the counties are covered by varying proportions of this national park. So the national park is still under the control of the central government, whereas the counties are under the control of the people that live in the county. And they elect democratically their leaders now, which is a big radical departure from the Suharto years.
So I bet the park is encroached by people around it.
That's correct. So what we see, because we've already discussed this history, this legacy of agriculture and natural resource exploitation that we find in Sumatra and other islands, well, there's a kind of a dependency on natural resources and agriculture for the people. It's how they get ahead. It's how they provide for their families. It's on smallholders, but also in terms of making money for your county or for your district. One way to do that is to expand agricultural production through plantations. And so what we find in these districts around the park is that they are not able to exploit the land that is in the park. So we find a significant tension between the central government and these district governments, and that's manifested in the behavior of the people.
So we'll learn more about this. We're going to need to take a short break. And I'm Hong Jiang, and this is Asia in Review. And we've been discussing deforestation in Indonesia. And when we come back, we'll learn more about it.
I'm Bill Spencer, President of the Hawaii Venture Capital Association. We do monthly luncheon programs with ThinkTech about things that matter to Hawaii entrepreneurs, investors, and business service providers. So join us on the fourth Thursday of every month at the Plaza Club. For information about upcoming events or to join our mailing list, visit hvca.org. See you there.
Hello, we're back. We're live, and this is Asia in Review at ThinkTech Hawaii. And we've been speaking with Keith Bettinger from Manoa about deforestation in Indonesia and why it's so hard to stop it. So we were talking about your research site and the post-Suharto period, the government policies, trying to address the problems of the Suharto period. Do you find it successful in some ways, the post-Suharto policies in terms of stopping deforestation, delaying forest destruction?
Well, I think it depends on, again, the time scale that we're looking at.
Let's let's look at now. Maybe some progress has been made, and what's happening now?
Well, part of it has to do with the level of control that the central government is able to exert over forest resources.
Okay.
And so when we can go back to 1998, when Suharto was first deposed, and these decentralization reforms liberated all of these hundreds of counties, and so essentially you have small localized governments that are independent agents, whereas previously they had been part of this vertical pyramid structure with Suharto sitting on the top, and they took their marching orders from Jakarta. Well, when Suharto fell, they were liberated. They were free to chart their own course and plot their own destiny. And so at that point, the situation was quite chaotic because the laws were still being written and implemented, and so there was a significant amount of deforestation that was sponsored by these district governments at this time. And when we think about the expression "make hay while the sun shines," so they were making hay while the sun shined, right?
So in other words, the local governments now have more power to do what they wanted to do.
They do, and in this transition period, they were exercising that power, and the central government was not capable of reining them in.
I see. Did you see a spike?
There was a huge spike in illegal logging, especially during that time.
I can see that.
And what we might call quasi or semi-legal logging as well, because the laws were somewhat ambiguous.
That's right.
But these district governments, they realized that there was a power vacuum, and in many cases they took advantage of that to exploit the resources.
That's right.
And the districts, just like any place else, is run by an elite group of people, and so they use the natural resources to enrich themselves and their families and their friends.
I see.
Now, since that has happened, from 2003, 2004, 2005, the central government has gradually been able to reassert more control over Indonesia's forest resources, and so that type of illegal logging has declined significantly. And so that's why now we see more deforestation coming from this economic transformation, or this land conversion that is taking place throughout the country.
So it's almost like one wave after another.
Yes,
you know,
exactly.
first is a little bit chaotic, and then you have the government reining in and really focusing on economic development. And then there you go, the increase of the palm oil.
Yeah, and now what's interesting about that, and I apologize for interrupting you, Hong, but what's interesting about that is that the deforestation that was caused by the logging in this chaotic period that I mentioned. Well, there's what we note about that is that the district governments and the central government were in conflict, right? And so this illegal logging emerged out of that conflict. But now, in terms of the expansion of palm oil, one thing that we note is that virtually all levels of government are in agreement that this is an avenue by which Indonesia will increase its income and bring its people out of poverty.
I can see we're in trouble. Indonesia is in more trouble.
Well,
its forests seems
we're
to be in more
hoping
trouble.
that slowly, as their decentralization and democratization, they have made a huge transition from an authoritarian government to a very democratic nation, and there are obviously some growing pains, and it takes some time to develop good governance and the institutions required to sustainably manage resources. And so we're hoping what we see over the longer term, or
so
the midterm,
in the future, you feel you have hope, and
well, we always have to have hope about things like that, and give people credit for being intelligent and being able to understand that their actions have consequences.
We have just a few minutes left. So we start with why people here in Hawaii, in the U.S., we need to be concerned about deforestation. What can we do to help along to slow the deforestation in Indonesia or in other places in the world?
Well, that's a very good question, Hong. I think that one of the things that we can do, because we really don't have very much direct influence about what happens there, but one of the things that we can do is educate ourselves as to what the drivers of deforestation are. So oftentimes we're tempted to say that villagers deforest because they're hungry or because they're impoverished. Right? We oftentimes we seek out a simple solution.
Another big one is because the population grows.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And normally when we really look at these issues, we understand that there's complex, systemic drivers of these problems that encompass politics and the economy and elements of globalization as well. And so if we pay attention as external actors, we realize that we actually are part of this system. We're indirect drivers. But if we educate ourselves as to our role in this, maybe we can make wiser decisions as to what we do, the things that we buy, and like that. And hopefully, in the long run, that will make a contribution to more sustainable management of resources, not just forest resources, but everything that we share around the world. Fisheries.
I know you are making your contribution. I know you teach a course called Globalization and Environment at UH, right?
Yes, that's correct. And we cover issues like this, and we try to dissect them, take them apart, and figure out what's really going on. And just like any problem, deforestation is multifaceted. It's multiscalar. There's things going on in Indonesia and outside of Indonesia, as we've learned today, that are contributing to that. And so what we try to do is really delve down deep into these problems so that we can understand how all of these things fit together. And it's my feeling that by doing that, we can envision better solutions to these problems. And we can understand better ways that we can work together to achieve solutions. So
on the part of the individuals, we basically need to become global citizen, and all should become almost like a quasi-geographer, right?
I think that's
you need to know what's happening in other parts of the world.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
We think geographically about things.
And think about, as you talk about the reasons for deforestation in Indonesia. There are local reasons, there are national reasons, and there are global reasons. Everything go together to contribute to this issue.
Right.
Okay, great. And we're just about out of time, and we'll need to wrap up. And I'm Hong Jiang, and this is Asia in Review, and we've been speaking with Keith Bettinger, PhD candidate and lecturer at UH Manoa, and we've been talking about deforestation in Indonesia. And I want to thank our production team at ThinkTech, and of course the producer Jay Fidel, who magically puts everything together. And I'm Hong Jiang. This is Asia in Review, and I'll see you next Tuesday. Thank you and goodbye.